Hello and welcome to the Free Film School podcast. Free Film School is a non-profit organization that offers uninstitutionalized free film and creative lessons for creatives in South Africa. This podcast is a snippet from one of our live classes on camera basics, facilitated by documentary filmmaker Kristen van Schie. Hope you enjoy.
The first thing that we're going to be starting with today, it is a little bit of theory. I don't want you to feel intimidated by the theory. These are all just tools for you to figure out how to use the cameras to tell the stories that you want to tell. Okay? Everything that cinematography is about directing the viewer's attention to what you want them to be paying attention to. This is pretty different to news videography, because in news videography, you're just trying to do coverage. You're trying to shoot as much as possible. It's what we call B-roll. But when you're making a film, there isn't B-roll. Everything that you're making is your A-roll. It is your important footage. And every shot can be and should be communicating something to the audience. So what we're going to be learning today are the tools you can use about how you can communicate what you want to communicate to the audience. So please don't feel intimidated by the theory. Everything we learn in theory, we're immediately going to try and practice. And just think of it all as tools, okay? The first thing we're going to talk about is exposure. And exposure is basically the amount of light that you are letting into your camera. And you have three tools to control your exposure. The one is your aperture, the other one is your shutter speed, and the other one, the last one, is your ISO, or back in the film days, your ASA, it's your sensitivity. Does anybody have an idea what aperture is? If you were to look at any lens and take the lens cap off, right? There's a hole in the middle of the lens that allows light through. The aperture is a description of how wide open that hole is. Is the hole open quite small and letting in a little bit of light? Or is your aperture wide open? Is it letting in a lot of light? And when we're talking about aperture, we often talk about it as an f-stop. So when you see it on the camera, you're going to see it described as an F and a number. Okay? When the camera is wide open, when there's a lot of light coming in, that number is smaller. So it's an inverse. The smaller the number, the more light. The bigger the number, so something like F16 means less light. Okay, so let's immediately, everybody, have a look at your cameras and let's see if we can find where you would find the aperture on the camera. If you found it on the screen on your camera, your f-stop, like I said, is represented by an F number. F5.6. Okay, so let's have a look at what happens. We change this number, and what happens? We get less and less light. All right? That hole is really small now. There's a lot less light coming in, but I open it all the way up, and I get a lot more light in. Okay, so aperture is one of our first ways that we can control the exposure, the amount of light that is falling onto our image. The next one we're talking about is shutter speed. There's like a little window that opens and closes. In front of that hole that we're opening and closing is a little window that does that. And if it's doing it really fast, there's less light coming in. But if it does it slowly, there's more light coming in. Okay, your shutter speed is represented as a fraction because we're talking about fractions of a second. So a shutter speed of 1/125 is a really fast shutter speed. It's 125th of a second. A shutter speed of 1/8 is a really slow shutter speed. Okay, it's an eighth of a second. So once again, we have an inverse here. The bigger this bottom number equals less light. The smaller this bottom number is more light. And sometimes you don't even have to use a fraction. Sometimes you can set your shutter speed at a full 5 seconds, 15 seconds, 20 seconds if you want to do long exposures. And let's find the shutter speed on your cameras and see if we can figure out how to change them. So play around with that, see what it does. And what you can also try to do is put somebody in front and see what happens when you change the shutter speed, what it starts doing to movements. Okay, so as you would have seen, the bigger that number at the bottom of your fraction, the less light is coming into your camera. The smaller that number at the bottom of your fraction, the more light is coming into the camera because the shutter is moving slower, right? So we can use shutter speed as a way to change the way our images look. They can be really blurred or they can be incredibly sharp. I'm going to show you some examples when I'm finished with this so you can see exactly how these can be used. But I just want to move on to the last section of our triangle here. And this is ISO, ASA, basically sensitivity. We're talking about the sensitivity of the film or of the memory card to light. Now, it used to be that cameras didn't have great capacity with ISO. If you increased the ISO, what you also did was you increased the noise, the grain. So it's in a dark situation. You can't slow your shutter speed down anymore because if you do, the image is going to blur. All right? You've opened your aperture up as much as it can. This number can't get any smaller. You're letting as much light in as you can. So the only other option you have is to increase your ISO. This is the one where if the number goes up, then the light also goes up. It's at least nice and logical in that sense, okay? So generally your camera is sitting at ISO 100. That's your base number. But you're in a dark situation and the only way that you have to bring more light in is to increase the sensitivity. You start lifting that number up. ISO 200, ISO 400, ISO 800, ISO 1600. Digital cameras have come a long way. So it used to be that if you went anywhere close to ISO 800, your image was filled with noise. Just lots of that digital mess, okay, that makes an image look like it's low quality. Cameras nowadays are getting better and better and better. So now you can go to like ISO 64,000 and still not have that much noise. So this can be a very powerful tool in low light situations to increase the light if you have no other option. Okay, so see if you can find the ISO on your camera. You're looking for a number that's usually, it's either 100, 200, 800. See if you can find it and see if you can change it. So in this exposure triangle, what we're trying to do is to keep these three elements in balance with each other all the time. So somewhere in the middle of these three elements is the exposure that you're looking for, so-called perfect exposure. All right? Now, as a filmmaker, you might want to use exposure according to your own needs, okay? Something doesn't necessarily have to be perfectly exposed. If you want a space to feel gloomy, you might underexpose it, which means there's less light coming in. If you want to shoot a scene that feels heavenly, you might overexpose it so that there's more light coming in, so that it feels airy. But then why not just find the three settings that work for you and leave them there and then never change them? So each of these three functions can also be related to an artistic need, okay? So it's not just a matter of letting light in. They change the way an image looks. So your aperture is related to depth of field. Your shutter speed is related to motion blur or the speed of motion, okay? And like I said, your ISO is related to grain. Does anybody know what depth of field is? So if you imagine that you are here with the camera and the lens, and you are filming somebody here, in between the camera and the person, right, there's this distance. And when we increase our f-stop, right, which means it's a small number, when we open our lens up, it creates many fields of vision between you and the person, and many fields of vision between the person and maybe the tree that is behind them, which means that you are focusing on a specific plane. If your f-stop is low, which means that that number at the bottom is big, like f22, it flattens this. It takes away these spaces. So let's have a look at what this looks like practically. I want you to be able to imagine this practically. If I want you to look at the people who are in the back row, I focus there. If I want you to look at the people in the front row, I focus there. If I increase my f-stop, okay, now I've changed this, which means my exposure triangle has been thrown out of sync, so now I have to change something else to balance that, okay? I can't just change it and then leave it there. Do you see now how the back row and the front row are more or less both in focus? Because what we've done is we've flattened it. Okay, so as a storytelling technique, what you can do is if you want to draw specific attention to a specific thing that's happening in your scene, to make it stand out from everything, you can use a really shallow depth of field to go, this is the person I want you to look at. Do we have an understanding here of how this works? Okay, play with it on your camera. Play with depth of field. Set your apertures nice and low. Set your apertures nice and high. and see how that changes the images. To make this exercise work, you're going to have to find the focus ring on your lens. You're going to have to figure out how to focus. All right, so I want to show you some examples of what this looks like and how we use it to our thing. First was just a couple of very simple stills examples. A nice, beautiful, shallow depth of field. The thing we want to be paying attention to is the spider. We can see gorgeous detail in it. We can see its web. We can see the dewdrop on the web, and everything in the background is blurred out. This is taken at a very, very large f-stop. Okay, we're looking at like f1.2. It gives us this lovely focus. The spider is the thing that you want to look at. Okay, did you guys see all of that? Yeah. All right, Bond walks into the room. As he moves into the room, something catches his attention. How does the filmmaker show you what catches his attention? They pull focus, right? So this is shot at a nice shallow depth of field. So it starts there, and then as he suddenly turns the focusing ring, the cinematographer draws your attention to the broken glass. This is what's caught Bond attention. As he walks to the bathroom, the focus is on him as he's opening the door. But as he opens the door, the cinematographer changes focus again, and it ends up on the woman who's sitting in the shower. That is the person who is now, our attention is now on. Our focus is shifted from Bond to Vesperlant, and the cinematographer has done that by pulling focus, by changing focus. All of this is done at a shallow depth of field. At a wide depth of field, this wouldn't work because everything in the room would already largely be in focus. So they wouldn't be able to draw your eye to what they want you to look at when they want you to look at it. So do you see how that shallow depth of field can be used as a tool to direct attention? All right, so let's have a look now at shutter speed and motion blur. So we have this triangle. If you move one thing, everything else gets affected as well. These are all connected, right? You want to shoot at a nice shallow depth of field because you want to create this kind of attention-grabbing movement in your images. The problem is, you take your f-stop nice and low to create that shallow depth of field. There's lots of light coming into your camera, but now it's too much light. You have to adjust it somehow. You have to control that light somehow. So what do you change? If you have a fixed lens on your camera, basically if the lens doesn't come off the camera, you're a bit limited. But what a lot of people will always tell you is where you should spend your money is not on the camera body, but on the lens. Lenses are where you get your beautiful image quality. A lens that's able to get to like a very wide aperture, like f1.2, they call it a fast lens. And I'll explain that to you now, because if your aperture is now wide open, you have two options for limiting the amount of light that's coming into your camera: your ISO and your shutter speed. What if your ISO is already at 100? It can't go any lower than it already is. Your only option now is to change your shutter speed. Okay, so you have to make the shutter go faster so that less light is coming into the camera. But this can cause a problem for us as cinematographers because there are certain frame rates or shutter speeds that we kind of work with for standard cinematography, all right? The standard frame rates that we will work with in cinematography is, depending on the editor you're working with, either 24 or 25 frames per second, which translates to a shutter speed of about 1/50. So in general, when you are shooting a standard video, your shutter speed is always going to be at 150. Okay, that's where it's supposed to be. It's supposed to be at 1/50. That's because this matches with what we call natural motion blur. It's the blur that looks most similar to what we see in normal life. When you start changing this number to either lower or faster, if the number is a lot lower, if your shutter speed is slower, as you saw when you were moving around, you get more blur. Okay, that's not what we see in normal life. If you make it faster, it gets jittery, also not what we're used to seeing in real life. But that is only if that is what you are trying to achieve, is natural motion blur. You can break this rule according to your needs. Again, these are tools for you to use. There isn't a rule that says you have to shoot at f2.8 and 1/50. So if what you want is a dreamlike quality in your imagery, where everything is floaty and blurry, then you can mess with the shutter speed to create that. If you want really static, choppy imagery, you can increase your shutter speed and you can create that. A lot of the times when they're shooting war sequences or action sequences in films, they'll increase that shutter speed because it makes the motion that much harder. If you're just watching normally a football match being broadcast on TV, just the game itself is probably being shot at a normal frame rate. But then you know from like those gorgeous slow-mo replay shots, those must have been shot at a higher frame rate. But that's the camera that's giving you the nice wide view of the pitch is not the same as the camera that's giving you the slow-mo close-up shot of the guy taking the shot. Also, if you're shooting a video for a sports match, that's not the same as shooting a film about sports or a feature about sports where you get to be creative. If you're just shooting the match for the sake of shooting the match, then you have your standard. Now, if you're shooting photo, you would have to use quite a high frame rate quite a high shutter speed to get what you're looking for. Because shutter speed allows us to freeze the action. If this was shot at a low shutter speed, her leg would be blurred, her hand would be blurred, but it's shot at a really high shutter speed. So it's captured the moment. It's shot at a beautiful shallow depth of field, so she stands out from her background because the black background is all blurred. So you see that the photographer here has balanced the wide open aperture with a very fast shutter. That's how they've controlled that light, and it gives us that image. But you can also use blur to create what you want in sports. By having a lower shutter speed, we get the blur of the horse race, which creates movement. It's what helps us feel that the horses are moving fast. If this was shot at a really high shutter speed and the horses were captured still and static, the picture wouldn't feel the same to us. We wouldn't feel that distinction between the audience and the horses. So you see how these are tools for you to use. They're tools for you to mess about according to what you want to communicate in your image. If the one goes up, usually to balance it out, the other must come down. Right? If your aperture goes wide open, maybe you have to bring your shutter speed down, but if bringing your shutter speed down affects what you want to do, you can't adjust it, then we have this other tool that we use in cinematography. I don't think I have an ND filter with me, but cameras will have filters built into them. If I'm in a position where I cannot adjust my aperture, or no, I can't close it anymore because of my needs. I want to take a shallow depth image, right? I don't want everybody to be in focus. I only want one person to be in focus. For example, for color needs, perhaps I can't go any lower for this ISO. That's a different story. Okay, if I'm shooting on log, sometimes there's a certain ISO you have to be shooting at. But if there was too much light coming into my image still, with this camera, I have filters built in to the camera. So I press one button, the filter comes down. Press another button, another filter comes down. All right, this is really useful for shooting outside. It's like sunglasses for your lens. DSLRs and a lot of cameras do not have this built into them. Mirrorless cameras do not have this built into them. Broadcast and cinema cameras do. What you have then is you have filters. This is just a UV filter, so it doesn't count. It just protects the lens from UV rays and stuff. But you do get filters where it's like a sunglass for your lens. And when you screw it on, it immediately is allowing less light to come into your camera. So if, for example, you have specific needs where you cannot change the shutter speed, you can't make your shutter speed any faster, your ISO is as low as it can go, and you are restricted by how much more you can control your aperture, again, because there's a look you want to get, putting these sunglasses on your camera is one of the ways that you can control the amount of light coming in. So you have set your camera to the aperture that you want to set it at. You've set your camera to the shutter speed you want to use. Your exposure is in the space that you'd like your exposure to be. The next thing you have to do, that you need to do, is what we call a white balance. A white balance helps set the color of your camera. If you are set to the wrong exposure, your white balance will be off, so it's really important that you do your exposure first, okay, and then you do your white balance. Now, color theory is an entirely different part of cinematography that we're not going to touch today. There are different ways that you can use different colors, different tones to explore emotions in your film. We're not going to be looking at that today, so we're just going to be looking at balancing our color. So once you've set your Once you've set your exposure where you'd like it to be, you need to fill your lens with white and set your camera to be like, this is white, so your camera can recognize what white is, and then it balances all your other colors. And your temperature is reflected in Kelvin, like degrees, all right? The more degrees, the hotter, the warmer your image is, the more yellow is in it. The colder your image, the more blue is in it. So I felt that there was far too much yellow in my image, so I cooled it down a little bit until I find that feels more or less like where I want the temperature to be. That feels like it reflects what my eyes are seeing, okay? So let's have a look if you can find the white balance on your cameras and if you can set them. If you film in a nice neutral, balanced light throughout, it's easier to play with later in post.
Okay.
If you film in a very yellow setting, you can fix that in post, but it's always harder to fix things than it is to just film correctly from the beginning.
Okay.
So that might be just a tint that they apply uniformly over the film at the end. All right, so you have set your exposure, you figured out the aperture you want to shoot at, you figured out the shutter speed you want to shoot at, you've decided what you want it to look like. Now we start thinking about the sizes of the images that we want to take, okay? We've done our temperature grading, everything. Now we're going to start thinking about the sizes of the image. So, do any of you know the different kind of image types that we could work with? What kind of shot is this? It's a wide shot. Pretty self-explanatory. It's a nice wide shot. This is good for setting the scene, showing the location where something is happening. I move in a little bit here. Okay, we try focus on a specific group of people. What kind of shot do we have here? A medium, okay. Maybe a little head and shoulders here gives us a medium close-up, all right? If I want a close-up, we're getting a frame in the shot, a face in the shot. What do you think some of the uses of these different shots might be? Let's have an idea. What might the use be of me focusing on one specific face be over here? What are you getting from this image right now? Exactly. We're seeing his discomfort. He's not thrilled with this, okay? And we can see it because we're close to his face. We can see the agony. What might I get from a medium shot like this? When might you use a shot like this? Dialogue, perhaps, right? Not dialogue where the two are maybe facing off against each other, but maybe one where they're on an equal footing, right? You're shooting two people on par with one another. A wide shot, like I said, really good for setting the scene. It's often what we have called an extreme wide. These are good for establishing shots. You establish this is where the action happens. We use this a lot in journalism as well, where there's like the wide shot, here is where the news is happening. The medium shot, this is the person who is doing the news. The close-up, here is the action that the person is doing. Okay, and it's the same in film. You're trying to focus the audience's attention to show them, here is where we are. This is your main character. This is the thing I want you to look at with this close-up. Sometimes these can be used quite formulaically. You'll see it a lot where people will do wide shots, medium shot, close-up, close-up, close-up. Wide shot, medium shot, close-up, close-up, close-up. But there's no rule for how many times you must mix between the different shots or anything. You use them according to what you need to tell in your story. If you're telling a film about one person's very intense personal struggle, and the way you want to do that is by just focusing tightly on their face the whole way through that film to force the audience to feel what they're feeling, then you're going to hone in on those close-ups, right? If you're telling a film about one person's journey through the wilderness, about how small they feel in comparison to the great big world of nature around them, you're going to do lots of wide shots that show all of the surrounding nature and how small they are in comparison to that nature. You would also be shooting something like that at probably a pretty small aperture because it gives you less depth of field, which means your person and the mountains behind them and the snow on top of those mountains would all be in focus together. If you have a fixed lens on your camera, how are you going to change your shot size? You're going to physically move, okay? If you can't zoom in and out with the lens, you are going to pick the tripod up, holding onto the camera, you are going to walk backwards and create a wide. You're going to move forwards and create the close-up, all right? Sometimes that is required. Sometimes you don't have an option, especially if you're shooting a lot of stuff on your phone. If you zoom in, the image gets messy. It gets very noisy. So to get the better quality image, you're going to have to move yourself. This is why today's warm-up was so good, because cinematography is physical work. It's not just making pretty pictures, it's a physical job. You're carrying heavy equipment and you are moving around. So practice framing some images with each other. Do some wides, do some mediums, do some close-ups. Play around a little bit. All right, so just some background on what you're going to see. This is a film that is following an independent candidate in Japan's local government elections. And this is the last sequence in the film. I'm going to stop this before you see the election results. What do you think happens in this election? He doesn't win. This is the last scene in the film. You don't see a scene where we find out what the result is. Why do you think he loses? What about that image made you think that he loses? I think that might be less depth of field in that situation because it's shot, I mean, this is the director, is his own shooter there. He's shooting on a 5D. It's not cinematic. It's not a pretty image, right? So it's probably shooting not at a shallow depth of field there. It didn't look very shallow depth, but it is panning out, right? It is this dolly movement out with his walking backwards that makes the character smaller and smaller and smaller. I mean, we don't even need to see the scene where the results are read out. And in fact, though the director chooses to show the numbers at the end, he can leave that out and we still know what's going to happen. We still know this candidate is not going to win the election in his ward based on what we've been shown. Now let's think a little bit about all the different kinds of shots that we had in that sequence. If we go back to the beginning of it, the way it started was with a close-up, all right? He's our hero. This is the guy we've been following the whole way through the film. This is at the end of the film. He's standing there, he's campaigning, he has a microphone in hand. What would you expect to see when somebody has a microphone in their hand? What would the reaction shot be? A crowd, okay? But what happens when the camera does switch from that close-up to the medium? There's people walking by, we end up seeing an empty street. So the close-up creates an expectation with this narrow focus on our hero, and when the camera widens, it shatters that expectation, which makes us feel it even more intensely. If the director, Katsuhiro Soda, had just immediately started showing us the empty street, we wouldn't feel that shock of like, who's he even talking to as strongly as we do by expecting a crowd and then having that expectation be disappointed. Then what happens? Who do we start to focus on as the scene continues? The child, right? The child starts taking over the camera. The camera starts following the child. And what I love about this is that the director in that moment starts making us complicit. Because we as the audience stop caring about the main character. We as the audience get distracted. The camera follows the child, we follow the child. We're not listening. We kind of stop reading the subtitles at a certain point. What's the child doing? Oh, the child fell over. He's talking about the outfall of a nuclear disaster. We're not listening. The kid is really cute, right? It's his kid. It's the kid that he's mentioning in his speeches. This is why he's campaigning against nuclear energy, to protect his child. His child that doesn't care. His child's running around doing his own thing. And we as the audience don't care either. And then finally, my favorite part, that beautiful manual dolly backwards. As our character gets smaller and smaller, the metro comes in, it fades out the noise of what he's even saying. And so we already know what the result is going to be. So this flips the whole idea of having an establishing shot on its head. We don't start with the establishing shot saying this is where we are. We end with the establishing shot and start instead with this close-up on our character and then widen out to give the viewer more and more and more information. So composition, does anybody know what composition is? It's the layout of objects, characters, whatever, inside the frame. It's how you choose to place things inside the frame. And one of the most traditional ways to do this that we have in cinematography is, does anybody know? Rule of thirds. Rule of thirds. So divide your image up into 3 parts and you balance it according to those 3 parts. It can be 3 vertical parts, or it can be 3 horizontal parts, or it can be using the vertical and the horizontal parts together to place your images on the intersects. All right, so you can, for example, you want the audience to focus on a specific character. Where might you place that character? Okay, maybe they're in the center. That might be one way of doing it. If you want to show the character looking at something and it's still just one character in the frame, where might you put them? All the way to the side? Part of the way to the side? These are all different options, right? You can use the thirds. If you want to communicate that the character is looking at something in front of them, maybe you'd put them over here and have them facing that way so that there's all this empty space in front of them. Maybe you have two characters and you want to show them in balance with one another. Where might you put them? Yeah, you might put them on the two vertical lines. You might have a bunch of different objects in your image, and to create balance or symmetry, you might frame that the peak of the mountain is over there, that the tree is over here, that your character is lying on the grass over here. So we're using the thirds to create balance in our image. And there's so many different parts to this third. There are these vertical lines, the horizontal lines, the intersection points, the blocks themselves. All right, so there's many different ways to use this. So while we've still got some time, I'd like you to please play with the cameras that you're on now. What you need to do is you need to find how to put this grid on your screen, have that on the screen with you so that you can visualize exactly where you're placing objects.